have served me so well since I've been home, and will continue to. And lastly, I hope to explain to you and to give you some insight into how it was so much more than just my experience alone, but that of yours as well. Every single one of you, individually, experienced this with me and with my friends there. And perhaps that will become more apparent as we go along also. This experience of ours, yours and mine, began in February of 1966. I was flying a reconnaissance mission off the decks of the USS Kitty Hawk in the Tonkin Gulf. I was launched on the last launch of the last day on the line before the carrier was supposed to go into Hong Kong for 10 days of liberty. And that was one of my greatest regrets. But you can be sure I've since made up for that. My aircraft was hit by small arms fire, and the hit itself wasn't so tremendous, but it severed the hydraulic lines of the aircraft, spilling all the hydraulic fluid, thereby precluding my ability to steer. The engines were working great, and as soon as we took the hit, I turned the aircraft toward the sea to get as far out as possible to enhance our chances of rescue. I accelerated, went into burner, and the airplane did accelerate. However, as we were going across the beach, the control stick froze in my hand, and the airplane began to roll, and it continued to roll and went more and more rapidly with the nose dropping toward the horizon, and it became apparent to me that my crewman and I wouldn't be able to stay with the airplane. So I yelled to my crewman over the intercom, "Eject, eject, eject." I didn't hear him go, so I reached up and pulled my own face curtain, which automatically ejects him first, and then myself a split second later. Because by that time we had accelerated to about 680 miles per hour, I was knocked unconscious immediately. And for all practical purposes, had I never regained consciousness, I would have died then. And many of my friends used to say, instead of when I was shot down, they would say, when I was killed, because it was so close to the same thing. I regained consciousness 10 or 15 minutes later, I'm not really sure how long, floating in the water about a quarter of a mile off the coast. Unconsciously, due to the repetition of my training, I had released my parachute, my oxygen mask, deployed my survival kit, and inflated my flotation gear, all subconsciously, without realizing it, with a broken arm, dislocated elbow and shoulder, and many cuts and burns and bruises. My crewman was about 50 yards away, already inflating his life raft. And there were several boats full of North Vietnamese coming out toward us, shooting in the water around us and over our heads. And there were no aircraft overhead. And it appeared to us that escape was simply out of the question. And it was. Very shortly, the first boat pulled up alongside of me and very roughly pulled me inside and began stripping me of my survival gear. And just then, two of our own aircraft did finally show up overhead, and not realizing that we were in those boats, they began rolling in on strafing patterns with machine gun bullets bracketing our boats once across the bow, and I could remember pulling myself up and watching those planes rolling in as the bullets would bracket the bow and then the stern and then the bow and the stern. Finally, after 6 or 7 passes, they broke it off, realizing that we had in fact been picked up by the boats. As soon as we reached the shore, we jumped out on the breaker line and ran across a very wide expanse of beach and dove behind a rice paddy dike, just as another aircraft rolled in and fired a pack of rockets and blew those boats to splinters. Sometime during the battle for our capture that day, my crewman, my friend, was killed. I'm not really sure how. He was either killed by our own aircraft strafing or by the Vietnamese out of excitement or revenge, or his boat was sunk. But I never saw him again. And that was my introduction to North Vietnam. Well, our trip to Hanoi took about 6 or 7 days because we were very far south in the country of North Vietnam. And we traveled by a Russian-built Jeep-like vehicle across very ruddy, bombed-out roads. We forded rivers and went across pontoon bridges because most of the regular bridges had been bombed. And during that trip, every time we made a stop at a hamlet or some group of buildings, I would convince myself that we had arrived at the POW compound in which I was to be kept. And all that time I was looking for that classic case, such as the POW compound that you may recall from that old World War II movie, Stalag 17. Or the TV series, Hogan's Heroes, you know, where the guard's kind of a roly-poly guy and they laugh and scratch and the guys sit around and they have mouse races and bed cigarettes and play the guitar a little bit and some volleyball. That's not too bad. Can last out the war at that rate. So when we reached the capital city of Hanoi and pulled up in front of that huge fortress-like prison called Wa Lo, and Wa Lo in Vietnamese means fiery forge. It was named by the Vietnamese themselves, by their treatment that they received under the French there during the days of colonialism. I was taken through those big iron gates of Wa Lo prison and down the corridors into my first cell, shoved very roughly inside, and the heavy wooden door slammed behind me and the iron bolt clanked home with a note of finality. And I looked around and couldn't believe where I found myself. I was in a tiny cell about the size of a single bed. There was a concrete slab on one side coming out of the wall about 18 inches wide, and that was to be my bed, at the foot of which was a set of ankle stocks, wooden on the bottom, and a heavy iron bar that came down across the top with a large padlock. There was one window very high in the cell with a double row of iron bars through which all I could see was the top of that 18-foot wall which surrounded the entire city block-sized prison, shards of broken glass embedded in the concrete on top and strands of barbed wire above that. There was one small can in the corner of the cell that was supposed to take care of all my physical needs. And the cell just reeked of the human misery, the decades of human misery that had been there before me. And I think the first thought that might have gone through my mind was something like, hey babe, this ain't the Navy that you shipped over for, you know, and indeed it wasn't. Because, like every naval aviator flying from the decks of an aircraft carrier, it always happens to the other guy. Although we're prepared, it's going to happen to someone else, not me. Well, that period of initial adjustment there where the realization of my plight really began to sink in, that in fact I had been captured and that I was a prisoner of war. And those initial interrogations and torture sessions were intense. Sometimes when you'd only have time to come back to your cell and sort of lick your wounds and take a big breath and get ready for the time that you knew was sure to come when those keys would rattle outside your door at the wrong time of the night again. That was a very difficult time. And you can be sure that I prayed a lot. At first, as I recall, my prayers were kind of futile. I remember saying something like, God, if you just give me those last 5 minutes to fly over again, you can be sure I'd fly somewhere else for starters. Or futile like, God, please get me out of here as soon as possible. Get me home to my loved ones, to my country, Lord. I don't really care how. Let there be a military victory, a political settlement, a POW exchange. God, I don't care how, but please let it be soon. I don't know how long I can endure this. And honestly, if at that time I had realized that it was going to be for 7 years and 9 days, I don't know what I would have done. As I would pray, the realization of the futility of those prayers began to sink in. And I would say to myself, this just isn't going to do. And finally, my prayers took a new turn. A new turn to sound something like, okay, God, if this is the way it's going to be, for however long, then God, help me to make it count for something positive. It has the potential, if you will, to be my personal dark ages of this period of time, however long. Help me instead to turn it around to my personal renaissance. God, help me to learn something new every day, to emerge from this experience a better man in every way that I can. Help me to go home a better American, a better citizen, a better officer, a better husband and father, a better friend to all of my friends. God, help me to make it count for something positive. Well, after that point, which I consider a turning point in my prayers, and in comparing notes with my friends there at later times, we all reach that point sooner or later. My life took on a new meaning, for indeed, every day there was something to accomplish, something new to learn, and it helped the time go faster because we had confidence that we weren't living in a vacuum, but something was being accomplished, indeed. And as I would pace back